I am Liana. I'm the librarian in charge of the scripture collection at the American Bible Society. It's been my job for the past 25 years, and it's been a wonderful job. Thank you for letting me share with you some of the books that I love. I have here two editions of the New Testament in Greek. They were both published by Robert Estienne, a humanist, an editor, a publisher, a scholar, who is remembered for his editions of the Greek and Latin classic authors, and for an extraordinary Latin and French dictionary in numerous volumes, I can't remember, and for the first extremely comprehensive Latin dictionary ever published. Robert Estienne was known throughout Western Europe as a scholar and a publisher. And in England, he was so popular with the academic world that they adapted his name to English, and they refer to him as Robert Stevens. And that's how the translators of the King James Bible refer to him. They talk about him in the preface, and they naturally say it's Stevens. During his lifetime, Robert Estienne was protected by the King of France, Francis I. And like Erasmus, he had sympathy for the Reformation, which of course created many problems for him. As long as King Francis lived, he was untouchable. But when Francis died, Robert Estienne thought it more prudent to flee from Paris and go to Geneva. The big folio edition of the Greek New Testament I have in front of me was printed in 1550 in Paris. The very small New Testament, printed 1 year later, was printed in Geneva. The big one is known as the Editio Regia, the regal, the kingly edition. And it was printed in a very beautiful Greek font devised by Garamond. We can see in the printed text that the text is divided according to the older system, ABCD, segments on the pages. In addition to that, what we see on the margin of the text are critical notes. Basically, this is the first edition of the Greek New Testament published with critical notes. Actually, Robert Estienne invented the critical apparatus, which is the cornerstone of textual criticism and of any scholarly edition of an ancient text. The text published by Robert Estienne was based on a comparison of about 15 Greek manuscripts available in Paris. And it's also obvious that Estienne used the Complutensian text, the text of the polyglot, printed in 1517. And there are references to readings from the polyglot. Basically, the text published by Estienne continued to be reprinted with minor editing until the end of the 19th century. In 1633, the text printed by Stephanus came to be known as the received text, the Textus Receptus. The formula was first used in a small edition printed by the Elzevirs in Amsterdam, and it became immensely popular, and everybody refers to the text of the Byzantine manuscripts of the Greek New Testament as the Textus Receptus. Let's look at the much smaller edition published by Stephanus 1 year later in Geneva. It's actually a set of 2 volumes, and it includes the Greek text in the middle with 2 Latin translations, the Vulgate, the Jerome's translations, and the Erasmus. What is so significant about this smaller edition is the division into verses. We may see that this division doesn't exist in the larger folio edition. It doesn't exist anywhere because it was first invented by Stephanus here. About 30 years later, after the publication of this New Testament, Stephanus' son Henri Estienne wrote somewhere that his father worked on the division into verses while traveling from Paris to Lyon. And the text, as written by Henri Estienne, was in Latin, and what he said was inter equitandum, which most people understood as while riding on a horse. Now, it's sort of difficult to imagine the scene. He would have had the larger folio edition with him on the horse. He would have had the reins of the horse in one hand, and he would have marked on this larger edition the division into verses. The Latin text actually can also be interpreted that he did it during the breaks he took from riding on the horse, which makes a far more acceptable story. The Bible was always conceived as a number of separate books. That's the oldest division. The division into chapters was done around 1220, so long before the invention of printing. It was done by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who wrote the text of the Magna Carta. The Langton division into chapter was almost immediately adopted everywhere, and it stands to this day. The division into verses goes back to this very small edition of the Greek New Testament. For the Old Testament, Robert Estienne did the division and published it for the first time in 1555 in an edition of the Latin Vulgate. And I'm very happy to say that we also have that edition. The division into verses has its problems, of course. The division into chapters has some problems. People may think that there are verses too long and some verses are too short, that the normal division according to the meaning of the story does not always correspond to the division into chapters and verses. But these are all things that attributable to human error. According to the Stephanus division, the shortest verse of the entire Bible is in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 35, which I have here. The verse, in English, the verse has just two words, Jesus wept. In Greek and in Latin, it has three words. Lacrimatus est Iesus in Latin and edacrus en ho Iesus in Greek. Maybe the most significant feature of the folio edition, the 1550 Editio Regia, is the critical apparatus. Practically, Robert Estienne invented the concept of a critical apparatus. We don't have any original edition of the New Testament. There was no printing at the time. Normally, today we consider that the first printed edition has the texts that the author wanted to print. There is no such thing for Greek, there is no such thing for Latin texts. And editions of the Greek and Latin texts are based on comparing various manuscripts. The critical apparatus was designed to explain what reading in the text was taken from what manuscript. It allows the reader to understand how the text was put together and how much credibility each reading has.